Abram had been walking for years, not in circles, not aimlessly, but without a rival. The voice that shattered his certainty in Ur had promised descendants and land. Yet as the seasons turned and the flocks multiplied, one truth remained unchanged. Sarai's womb was closed. In the ancient Near East, childlessness was not merely personal grief, it was social death. A man without an heir was a man without a future. His name would dissolve into forgotten genealogies. His property would scatter among distant relatives. His story would end with him. Abram had left the greatest city in the world on the strength of a promise. But promises, unlike city walls, cannot be touched. They cannot be measured in cubits or weighed in silver shekels. And so the question hung in the desert air, unspoken but inescapable. Had he heard correctly? This is where the second great test begins, not in the leaving, but in the waiting. Canaan was not a single unified territory. It was a constellation of city-states, each ruled by local kings who viewed their domains as sovereign kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from the Middle Bronze Age reveals a landscape of fortified towns perched on hilltops, controlling trade routes and water sources. These were not primitive settlements. Excavations at sites like Hazor, Megiddo, and Shechem show massive defensive walls, multi-chambered gates, and palace complexes. Between these fortified centers lay open grazing lands, spaces contested by pastoralists, merchants, and migrant groups. This was Abram's world. He was a mobile household navigating a fragmented political landscape. The strategic reality. To survive in Canaan required three things: mobility, diplomacy, and military capacity. Abram possessed all three. His household was substantial, hundreds of people, including family members, servants, and allied groups. When Genesis later records that he fielded 318 trained men for a military rescue operation, it reveals the scale of his operation. This was not a small family wandering with a few sheep. This was a clan capable of self-defense and negotiation. Yet for all his material success, the central promise remained unfulfilled. He had access to land, but did not own it. He had wealth, but no legitimate heir. The tension was existential. Genesis 14 presents us with a version of Abram that contradicts the image of the quiet shepherd. Here, we see Abram the general. A coalition of 4 powerful kings from the east, Mesopotamia and Elam, marched south to suppress a rebellion of 5 city kings in the Jordan Valley. This was a world war on a Bronze Age scale. Lot, living in Sodom, was swept up as a prisoner of war. The night strike. When the news reaches Abram, he doesn't pray for a miracle. He calls up his private army. That Abram had 318 trained men born in his household implies a total camp population of nearly 1,500 to 2,000 people. This was not a family. This was a mobile city-state. Using sophisticated guerrilla tactics, Abram pursues the Mesopotamian coalition all the way to Dan and launches a night attack under cover of darkness. He defeats the kings of the east. The man who left the empire had just defeated the empire. The meeting with Melchizedek. On his way back, Abram is met by a mysterious figure, Melchizedek, the king of Salem, ancient Jerusalem, and priest of God Most High. This is a cinematic moment in Scripture. Long before the tabernacle or the temple, here is a king-priest who recognizes the same God Abram serves. He brings bread and wine. He blesses Abram in the name of El Elyon, God Most High. The king of Sodom offers Abram the spoils of war, the wealth of nations. Abram refuses. He had sworn an oath that no man would say, "I made Abram rich." He wanted his wealth to have one source and one source only. He walks away from the plunder of empires. But he cannot walk away from the question that haunts him. Where is the sun? Following the adrenaline of war, Abram enters a season of existential dread. He had just defeated the kings of Mesopotamia. He had been blessed by a mysterious priest. He had refused the wealth of Sodom. But none of it mattered. He was old. He was childless. His heir was a servant from Damascus named Eliezer. The text places the encounter at night. This is significant. In the ancient world, night was the domain of the divine and the demonic. It was when boundaries thinned. Mesopotamian religion recognized this. Divination, dream interpretation, and celestial observation all operated in darkness. But the voice Abram heard was not filtered through priests or ritual. It came directly. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. The language is intimate, not the voice of a distant cosmic administrator, but of a protector addressing someone under threat. Abram's response is startling. He does not offer praise or gratitude. He challenges, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless?" This is not the language of pious submission. This is negotiation. This is a man reminding God of the gap between promise and reality. In Mesopotamian religious culture, such directness would be unthinkable. The gods were to be appeased, not questioned. But the relationship being established here operates on different terms. It is covenantal, not transactional. The response, beyond biology. The answer does not come in words alone. Abram is brought outside. The text does not specify whether this is literal or visionary, but the effect is undeniable. In the 21st century, we struggle to imagine the night sky of 2000 BCE. There was no light pollution, no city glow, no artificial brightness to drown the stars. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a luminous river of fire. Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be. This is not metaphor in the modern sense. In the ancient Near Eastern mind, the stars were fixed, eternal, and countless. To invoke them was to invoke permanence and magnitude. But there is something deeper here. The stars were also tied to divine order. Mesopotamian priests read the heavens as a coded language of fate. The movement of planets, the appearance of comets, the alignment of constellations, all were interpreted as messages from the gods. By taking Abram outside to see the stars, God was recontextualizing the very signs Abram had been trained to read. The heavens were no longer the domain of Babylonian astrology. They were the canvas of a personal promise. What happens next is one of the most consequential statements in human history. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. This sentence introduces something revolutionary, the idea that standing before God does not depend on ritual performance, but on trust. In Mesopotamian religion, righteousness was procedural. You maintained right standing with the gods by offering the correct sacrifices, observing the prescribed festivals, and consulting the proper authorities. Righteousness was compliance. But here, righteousness is relational. It is credited, not earned. It is a gift based on belief, not a wage based on work. This is the seed of what would later be called justification by faith, a concept that would shape Judaism, Christianity, and the theological architecture of Western thought. But it was not abstract theology when it was spoken. It was an old man standing under a desert sky, choosing to trust a voice against all evidence. Trust, however, required ratification. In the ancient Near East, covenants were not casual agreements. They were binding legal arrangements formalized through ceremony. Archaeological discoveries, including texts from Mari, Alalak, and Hittite archives, reveal a complex culture of treaty making. There were two primary types of covenants: parity treaties between equals, and suzerainty treaties between a superior and a subordinate. The latter followed a standard structure: historical prologue, stipulations, witnesses, blessings and curses, and a ratification ceremony. When Abram asks, "How can I know that I will gain possession of it?" he is not expressing doubt. He is requesting formalization. He is asking for the covenant to be enacted according to the recognized legal customs of his world. God's response is to meet him on those terms. The ritual. The instructions are specific. Abram is told to bring a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a pigeon. He is to cut the larger animals in half and arrange the pieces opposite each other. This is not arbitrary symbolism. This is a known covenant ritual called cutting a covenant. Examples of this practice appear in ancient texts and are referenced later in Scripture. The ritual involved the parties walking between the severed animal pieces, symbolically declaring, "May this happen to me if I break this agreement." It was a self-maledictory oath, a curse invoked upon oneself in the event of covenant violation. Abram prepares everything as instructed. Then he waits. While Abram waits, birds of prey descend on the carcasses. This detail is easy to overlook, but it carries weight. In the ancient symbolic world, scavenger birds often represented forces of chaos, death, or enemy nations. In later prophetic literature, birds of prey appear as agents of judgment or symbols of destruction. Abram drives them away. He is protecting the covenant space. The image is significant. Even in the preparation for divine promise, there is opposition. The forces that would consume and corrupt are present from the beginning. Then, as the sun sets, something overwhelming happens. A thick and dreadful darkness came over him. This is not peaceful nightfall. This is Pachad Shoshek, the terror of deep darkness. The language is visceral and disorienting. In this darkness, God speaks not only of promise, but of cost. What follows is one of the most sobering prophetic disclosures in Scripture. Abram is told that his descendants will be strangers in a land not their own. They will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. Only afterward will they return to this land in the 4th generation. The promise is reaffirmed, but the path is long and brutal. This is not triumphalism. This is a theology of delayed fulfillment and suffering within the plan. The covenant does not promise ease, it promises purpose through endurance. God also explains why the return must be delayed. The sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. This introduces a moral framework to history. Time is not neutral. Nations, like individuals, accumulate moral debt. Justice operates on a timeline that transcends individual lifespans. The Amorites, one of the dominant Canaanite groups, are given space to choose their trajectory. The conquest is not arbitrary, it is deferred judgment. This tension between promise and postponement, between hope and suffering, becomes a defining characteristic of biblical faith. As darkness deepens, the covenant is ratified. A smoking firepot and a blazing torch appear and pass between the pieces. The firepot, tanur, was a common household oven, but here it represents something divine. The blazing torch evokes the pillar of fire that would later guide Israel through the wilderness. Both are symbols of God's presence. Here is the shocking detail. Abram does not walk between the pieces. God does. In every known ancient Near Eastern covenant ritual, both parties pass through. Both invoked the curse upon themselves. But here, God alone moves through the path. This is a unilateral covenant. God is binding himself to his promise without requiring Abram to walk the same path. The obligation rests entirely on God. This is not a contract between equals. This is a sovereign commitment. God is declaring, "I will fulfill this, and I will bear the consequences if it fails." In a world where gods were capricious and covenant breaking was common, this was radical. God was stepping into the position of vulnerability. The covenant is then given geographic specificity. "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." This is not vague. The borders are defined. The territory encompasses the land of 10 people groups, including the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephates, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Historically, these names correspond to groups attested in ancient Near Eastern records. The Hittites are well documented in Anatolian archives. The Amorites appear in Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Levantine texts. The Jebusites would later control Jerusalem until David's conquest. This is not mythic geography. These are real peoples occupying real territory during the Middle and Late Bronze Age. The promise is concrete. It is not merely spiritual or symbolic. It is a claim to land, a claim that would shape the next millennium of history and remain contested to this day. After the covenant ceremony, the narrative moves forward. Years pass. Sarai remains barren. The promise is ratified, but biology does not comply. This is the burden of covenant faith, living between declaration and fulfillment. Abram has legal assurance, divine oath, and cosmic witness, but he does not have a son. Faith, in the biblical narrative, is not passive resignation. It is active trust within delayed fulfillment. Abram did not sit idle. He built altars. He negotiated with local rulers. He dug wells. He trained men. He defended his household. He lived as though the promise was certain, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. This is the paradox of covenant faith, acting on what is promised, but not yet seen. In Abram had certainty, but no promise. In Canaan, he had promise but no certainty, at least not the kind measurable by Mesopotamian standards. The shift was from managed order to trusted relationship, from institutional mediation to direct encounter, from sight-based confidence to hearing-based obedience. The covenant made with Abram under the stars was not an isolated moment. It was the foundation stone for everything that followed. When Moses stood before Pharaoh, he invoked the God of Abraham. When David established his throne in Jerusalem, he was fulfilling promises made centuries earlier. When the prophets spoke of return from exile, they appealed to the covenant cut in darkness. Even beyond the Hebrew scriptures, the covenant with Abraham became central to Christian theology. Paul would later argue that the promise preceded the law, and that faith, not ethnic descent, determined covenant membership. Islam honors Abraham as Ibrahim, the father of monotheistic faith and the builder of the Kaaba in Mecca. The promise made to one man in the second millennium BCE became the spiritual inheritance of billions. The covenant with Abram introduced a new way of being human before God. In Mesopotamia, standing before the divine required intermediaries, rituals, and institutional approval. In Egypt, it required royal mediation and mortuary cults. In Canaan, the local gods demanded sacrifices and seasonal rites. But the God who spoke to Abram required something simpler and more difficult: trust. Not blind trust, not irrational trust, but trust grounded in the character of the one making the promise. Abram believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. This was not because belief itself was meritorious, but because belief aligned him with the one who was trustworthy. The covenant did not make Abram perfect. He would later struggle with fear. He would attempt to force the promise through human means. He would stumble, doubt, and miscalculate. But the covenant did not depend on his flawlessness. It depended on God's faithfulness. Before the law was given at Sinai, there was a promise given under the stars. Before the temple rose in Jerusalem, there was an altar built in Canaan. Before the priesthood was established, there was a man who spoke to God directly. Abram stood in the darkness and believed. He did not understand the mechanics. He did not see the timeline. He did not control the outcome. But he trusted the voice, and history bent toward that trust. The covenant made that night was not just about land or descendants. It was about the nature of faith itself, about living in the tension between promise and fulfillment, about walking forward when sight fails, about building altars in foreign lands while waiting for a city whose architect and builder is God. Abram heard a voice in Ur and walked away from certainty. He heard a voice under the stars and believed against biology. The first act required courage. The second required faith. And in the space between those two acts, a new way of being human was born.